So welcome to our April seminar on the network heating and cooling. Today we are going to be discussing matters related to heating and cooling sector and various matters in relation to two speakers who are coming from Cardiff University and in Aalborg University in Denmark. So I'm Dr. Andy Smallbone. I'm the director of the EPSRC Network Plus for the decarbonisation of heating and cooling. And we're running this series of webinars, which are happening broadly every month, looking at various challenges across the topic. So this week, or this month, we're delighted to welcome speakers who are leading research around consumer responses to decarbonisation and the development of district cooling networks. So we're grateful to both presenters for providing their time today. First, we'll hear from Dr. Gareth Thomas from Cardiff University, who will present on the consumer attitudes and disruptions related to low carbon heat infrastructure. Gareth is a research associate in the School of Psychology at Cardiff University and has a research background in policy science and technology studies. He's specialising in social acceptability of socio-technical transitions, particularly in the field of energy. And recent research has examined issues of justice, vulnerability, social acceptability relating to transitions towards more flexible energy systems, and the ways identities and experiences rooted in place-based citizens' concerns and desires for transitions towards a low carbon economy. So, Gareth.
I should quickly say the work that I'm reporting on today has been funded through the EPSRC NUPA project with colleagues at Imperial College and Strathclyde. And the social science work package that I'm going to be talking about today has been conducted by myself, but also colleagues, Professor Karen Henwood and Nick Pidgeon. So the first question, I guess, is why bother looking at citizen views at all? And I guess the answer that I'd give is that citizens are quite deeply integrated within energy systems, both as energy consumers and producers, as voters and taxpayers that contribute towards subsidies and also have a say indirectly in kind of regulation of the system, but also as kind of civil society activists that experience things and will at times protest and launch campaigns against things they don't like, so they have a power to disrupt these transitions. And I would argue that's particularly important in the case of something like heating, where it's not just power sector decarbonisation, where it's individual sites quite unevenly distributed across the country. This is technology in people's homes and networks in every community that's going to need to change. The UK is currently heavily dependent on natural gas. It's about 85% of houses that are on the gas network for central heating. So it's not just the odd site where you might be building a new power plant or the kind of route of a new transmission line. This is everywhere, essentially. And in terms of the kind of UK government perspective, decarbonising heat at scale is seen as having a direct impact on consumers, both in terms of the kind of the costs of equipment, changes to energy bill structures potentially, within building adjustments, also adjustments on the network, so digging up the street to lay pipes for heat networks or reinforce the electricity grid to carry more electricity if you're thinking about installing heat pumps, but also changes to kind of consumer heating behaviours and what people do inside their homes. And the UK government is fairly worried about this, these kind of barriers to consumer action. And that's more or less backed up by the social science evidence we have at the moment. So surveys consistently indicate cost as the number one barrier for why people aren't installing things like heat pumps. And that's shortly followed up by kind of concerns about hassle about finding out about new technologies and living with the disruption of having potentially new equipment installed in the home, potentially energy efficiency upgrades, insulation, things like that put in. These are seen as barriers. Cost consistently comes out on top. But amongst the heat pump trials that we've had in the UK so far, there have been quite high dropout rates, even when the heat pump is being paid for. And a lot of that has been attributed to people hearing about what having a heat pump installed would do and deciding that, no, actually, they'd rather not have one, even if it's free. And even amongst the kind of the studies of people that have voluntarily chosen to install their own heat pumps, the kind of issues with performance changes in the kind of the experience of in-home heating, problems living alongside kind of construction work and all that stuff consistently comes up as a kind of a tinkering process that even people that are really committed to having low carbon heating kind of struggle to adapt to, at least for a while. So the focus of this work is predominantly on disruptions and looking not at kind of engaged publics that are interested in low carbon heating and already looking at installing it, but looking at the general public, if you like. And rather than asking them kind of short survey questions, the idea of this is it's qualitative research where we get groups of people together in groups of between 7 and 9 for an entire day, which allows us to provide a kind of a combination of information provision and group discussion to get people's feelings about the different disruptions that might come, not just with installing a heat pump, but also potentially hybrid heating, being connected to a heat network, or in the UK, there's a lot of focus at the moment on potentially hydrogen heating, so converting the gas network to carry low carbon hydrogen. And what we're aiming to do here is, rather than just kind of simple question and answers based on quite narrowly constrained information, what we're interested in is deliberation, so getting people to really think about their own homes and their own feelings about energy in the present, providing them with a bit of information and allowing for a kind of a reflection and a group discussion throughout the day to see how people's feelings change as they get kind of more familiar with the topic. And also to give us a kind of a qualitative view of what people value more between cost, digging up roads, roadworks for things like electrification, or those kind of in-home upgrades, those in-home disruptions. What do people really consider to be problematic in heat transitions? And the idea is hopefully maybe we might be able to put in some kind of mitigating measures to reduce that. Now, because decarbonising homes depends quite a lot on the kind of the age of the house, the building structure, its size, what we decided to do was we recruited 6 separate groups and we stratified them to reflect kind of different geographic and housing contexts. So we had 2 groups in Cardiff, both of which were kind of semi-detached houses built sometime between 1946 and 1989. One group was exclusively comprised of homeowners, and the second group were tenants, so people in rented accommodation, because we felt that this group have less kind of choice over potentially what might be installed in their homes, but also the timing of those installations. Our next group was in the suburbs of Gloucestershire, which is a fairly affluent town in southwest England. All of these houses were built after 1990, so reasonably good levels of energy efficiency, but detached houses and owned by the kinds of people that you might think would be amongst the first to install heat pumps. They were the kind of classic early adopter kind of demographic. We had another group in the Scottish borders, which mainly comprised of people in older rural properties and living without a connection to the natural gas grid. So these are people who, at the moment, currently their heating choices are somewhat constrained. And finally, we had 2 groups in Liverpool. These were all built their homes were all built before 1929. The first group were kind of hard-pressed terraces in the city centre, so these were a kind of a less affluent group. And the next group were from the kind of the suburbs of Liverpool and were mainly professionals in terraced houses or semi-detached accommodation. All of these groups were given the same kind of generic information materials, but during verbal discussions, we kind of outlined how the specific kinds of housing and areas that these people were in might impact the disruption they could be subjected to. And the first kind of form of disruption that came up quite regularly was kind of disruption being seen as an inconvenience. So this was stuff that was seen as bad, stuff that you might complain about, but not the sort of stuff that's likely to bring people out on the streets complaining about the injustice of it all, if you like. This mainly related to construction work, and on the network, it was viewed kind of with a fatalism, this idea that you get roadworks all the time anyway. You see them for utilities work, water company work, the installation of fibre optic broadband. In both the Cardiff and Liverpool groups, we had people arriving that day late because they'd been held up in roadworks. And it was they were kind of seen as just, it's inevitable. It's not something that you love, but it's not going to ruin my life, if you like. And in similar ways, upgrades to the home. So addition of kind of insulation measures, the fitting of a hot water tank for a heat pump or something like that, was seen as akin to the kind of periodic disruptions you get throughout the life course, just in the course of owning and maintaining your own home. Sometimes you have to repair things, sometimes you have to replace things. it's part of that kind of home improvement. Sometimes you rejig the internal layout of your home to kind of accommodate a changing family structure. It was the sort of stuff that, as Jill in Cardiff said, it's a pain, but you're glad when it's finished. So long as some sort of benefit comes from it, this kind of stuff is justifiable and understandable. At the same time, there were circumstances where inconveniences were identified as potentially a problem. So when it came to street works to lay things like pipes for heat networks or network reinforcement for the electricity grid, people in rural communities, the Scottish Border Group, were probably the least likely group to. They were the group that saw roadworks as a bigger problem, and the primary reason for that, it turned out, was because a lot of them lived down quite narrow roads with only one entrance and exit, where if that access was blocked off, potentially they couldn't access their home, was the concern, or it might entail a kind of a 2-hour round trip to redirect to get to local shops. There are also concerns raised about impacts on families with small children or older people or the mobility impaired, people who, if you're digging up the pavement, is there going to be space to get a wheelchair around? Are we going to be able to get access by car to unload the pram or pile the kids into the car as part of the kind of morning social commute, the morning school commute or commute to work, or both? And those same groups were generally seen to be the groups that were also most likely to be disrupted from in-home construction work. They were seen as being less able to relocate, so go out while work is being underdone to work or go to someone else's house. That was also seen as a problem for people working from home, and particularly people in rented accommodation. This idea that builders might come in at the behest of a landlord to fit a hot water tank or something like that, and the people living in the house wouldn't necessarily have much notice. And if they're working from home, that could be a big problem. The other area where inconvenience was seen as a real problem was the idea of disconnection while network changes took place. That tended to be seen as less of a problem for the electricity grid, where disconnection might be just for an hour or a morning. But for disconnection and reconnection, for conversion of the natural gas network to hydrogen, where the conversion process can potentially take longer, potentially up to a week, in order to drain the network of existing natural gas, refill it with hydrogen, and make sure that everything connected to it is safe and working properly. That can take longer. That can take up to a week. And participants saw that length of disconnection, of lack of availability for hot water in particular, was seen as a real problem, as hugely disrupting routine caring and hygiene practices that are kind of seen as essential and socially expected. That was seen as particularly a problem for people caring for young children. But the combination of people coming into the house, potentially checking your gas meter, your pipes, potentially replacing your boiler, and that disconnection from the grid was seen as just placing a huge burden on vulnerable people, and particularly the elderly. And this kind of exchange between Yasmin and Holly that I'm not going to read out, but you can read for yourselves on the slide. It was partly informed by Yasmin and Holly's experience of their own parents and grandparents, both of whom had been in the early stages of dementia. But the idea was this fundamental disruption to kind of the usual routine, particularly if you don't have a choice with it, if the gas network is being switched off and you have to have this work done, because it needs to be safe to have hydrogen put in, was seen as just completely unacceptable. And Yasmin's, it's going to kill them. And she was very much thinking of her own mother, just the stress of having people in the house and the disruption to that kind of daily routine was seen as potentially lethal to that group. The area where disruption tended to be seen as more problematic was in permanent disruption. So after the construction had finished, permanent changes to the fabric of homes or communities. Now, in some cases, this was kind of tied up with people's investments in their homes, either because they'd put in a lot of work themselves to do up their gardens, didn't want it digging up for a new supply cable or pipe. They'd converted their lofts and didn't want a hot water tank being put in there for a heat pump. Or they had kind of future plans to do that sort of work and didn't want disruption preventing them from doing things with their homes was kind of the idea. One of the strangest examples that came up was guy called Tom, who had recently had a new drive put in. It was a kind of ornamental driveway with expensive brickwork, and he'd done the work himself, and it had taken him a long time. He'd spent quite a lot of money on it, and as kind of insignificant as digging up the drive sounded to most of our participants, for Tom, that was a kind of a practical accomplishment that he'd worked hard on. And when asked, would you be prepared to have that dug up, his answer was just simply no. He wouldn't. That was a red line for him. And for other people, it was different things. It was kind of prize-winning flowers in their front garden, or Victorian tiles in their entrance porch. There was a small number of people, there were specific aspects of their home that they were emotionally invested in, that had an aesthetic value that was tied to their identity. It was part of who they were. And touching that for any kind of network upgrade or heating retrofit for them was seen as really problematic. At the same time, there were also concerns raised about the long-term performance, particularly of heat pump systems. This was particularly an issue in the Scottish border, where, because they're off the gas grid up there, they're reliant on very expensive oil heating. More houses have already had heat pumps installed, and the word of mouth in the Scottish borders, but also elsewhere, was not particularly positive when it came to heat pump. People had heard that you had limited hot water because of a hot water tank. The system didn't always get warm enough and provide sufficient heat. And in the three groups where that kind of previous experience and word of mouth was raised by participants, it was contagious. It really took over conversation. And kind of in those groups, heat pumps were definitely seen as a kind of a less viable and less attractive option. The other area where kind of permanent disruptions were seen as particularly problematic was in particularly smaller houses and urban areas, where both space for new network infrastructure, so secondary substations and things like that, was seen as limited. These are houses that are very tightly packed in. There's not very much space to be putting in additional substations if that's what you need to support more electric heating, but also space for equipment associated with heat pumps. So that might be space in the front or the back of the property to fit an exterior fan for an air source heat pump, or in far more cases, it was space for having a hot water tank, particularly amongst people who had already converted their lofts for living space, which again is a fairly common kind of home improvement practice. There's this idea that some houses a heat pump just wouldn't fit with the best will in the world. There were people living and sleeping in those spaces, and adding extra equipment would just push the space for human occupation out. At the same time, people were more positive about this in our group in Gloucester, where they had detached homes. And at the end of the workshops, most of our participants, when kind of push came to shove, said, if I need to find a space for it, I probably could. So it wasn't all doom and gloom, if you like. The far more problematic area of disruption was disruption to kind of cost structures. And this was the thing that people kept coming back to. Even though we were trying to focus on buildings and the physical infrastructure, people kept coming back to questions of, how much is a heat pump system going to cost? How much of my bill is going to change if I'm on a heat network, or if the network's converted to hydrogen? And that was seen as kind of problematic. On the positive side of this, a cost reduction was seen as the main thing that would make inconvenience and disruption more acceptable. If you could deliver a cost reduction in my bills on a regular basis, I'll put up with an element of disruption of people coming in, doing things in the home. I'll even put up with the loss of space potentially. But it was very much contingent on that cost reduction being available and people being able to afford the heat pump in the first place, if heat pump was technology under discussion. At the same time, for our participants in rented accommodation, and particularly the private rented sector, there were big concerns about what would happen if landlords were required to install heat pumps as part of building regulations. And a big concern that either the cost of heat pump installation would be just added onto rent, so rents would go up, or in a couple of cases, the idea that once the landlord had delivered this kind of efficiency improvement that might deliver cheaper bills, that they'd just evict the tenants so that they could put up the prices for the next person, or potentially sell the property. And in the UK at the moment, we are living through something of a crisis in the private rented sector, where there's just a shortage of property. So this is very much a live issue. Other kind of going back to the issue of cost reduction as a kind of a potential benefit people saw, there were other benefits as well. So in Liverpool, a discourse emerged that heat networks, and kind of a community-owned district heating scheme would be a really good option for that city in particular. Some of this, I think, comes down to the specific people in the group who quite early on latched onto heat networks as their kind of preferred option. But some of it, I think, is about Liverpool as a city, which, to give a bit of a context, it tends to be far more left-wing than most of the rest of England. Going back to the 1980s, there have been conflicts between Liverpool Council and the UK government over fundraising powers, and a sense that Liverpool is, slightly different to the rest of England, and a preference for kind of communal solutions. The trade union movement was very active in Liverpool during the 1980s, and it is still today a kind of a left-wing city that sees itself as slightly separate from the rest of England. And this idea of having a Liverpool-centric district heating system that was kind of locally owned and operated was seen as a bit of a way of getting one over on the Westminster government, and also ensuring that things like it was seen as a protection against rising prices and the kind of predations of a privately run energy system. That was fairly specific to Liverpool, though I suspect if you went to somewhere like Glasgow, you might get similar findings there. The other thing that kind of came up consistently was this idea of reducing reliance on Russia or kind of international gas markets, if you like, particularly in light of the kind of price rises we've been seeing over the last 12, 18 months. And that kind of reduction of reliance on natural gas really hurt perceptions of hydrogen, I think, across all groups, really, hydrogen heating, and also kind of hybrid boiler systems where there was still an element of gas in the heating mix. There was a perception across all groups that hydrogen and hybrid boilers weren't really addressing this kind of the underlying problem, either of rising prices or of kind of environmental problems. It was just seen as kind of shunting the problem further down the road into elsewhere. And they kind of emerged as a sort of a non-solution that people didn't really see the point in, even if the kind of installation costs were far lower than a heat pump. So the perception with those two technologies tended to be that, well, why would we go through this disruption to not deal with the problem, if you like? That was kind of the narrative that people subscribed to. At the same time, for kind of all of the heating solutions that were talked about, were kind of talked about in a very particular kind of historic context for the UK. So partly a cost of living crisis and rising in energy bills due to kind of global oil and gas prices. But the research was also conducted in 2022, 2023. So this was a time of significant turmoil in the UK government. Boris Johnson had just been forced to resign as Prime Minister in the wake of Partygate. Liz Truss had recently come into office and essentially tanked the pound with a somewhat disastrous mini budget, and herself was forced to resign between the Gloucester and Scottish Borders workshops. And there was kind of a sense that the situation in the UK at the moment was laughable, and how on earth can any government be trusted to get this stuff right? This is really complicated. And there were kind of longer term reflections on the trajectory of nuclear power in the UK, of fracking, of all of these things that have kind of come and gone in UK energy policy discourse over the last 10, 20 years, that was seen as kind of a lot of talk and not a lot of action, and not very much has been achieved. And there was a real feeling that whichever solution you get, why should members of the public have to put up with changes in their home, disruption on the network, if, as seems overwhelmingly likely, the government has probably got this wrong and are going to have to change their mind in 10 years' time, was kind of the discourse that emerged. And across lots of groups, we encountered a real sense of fatigue of what was seen as buck passing onto individuals, the idea that individuals might have to pay or contribute to the cost of a heat pump, put up with disruption in their homes. And there was a sense of both a kind of a desire for more information and choice, because there was a concern that if the government just offers one solution, that's probably going to be the wrong one, and we want to be able to opt out of it. We want information so that we can make our own choice about this, but also this really quite deep uncertainty about what is the best option, and is it even going to be doable for me? Across all groups, that was kind of an issue, and there was a kind of a sense that heat pumps might be the most rational decision. But if you want us to do that, you're going to have to pay for it, because we just don't have the money ourselves, was kind of what Chiara in Liverpool was saying. And that was reflective of loads of participants, particularly those in kind of rented accommodation. So there was this sense that if they want it to happen, they should pay for it because we don't trust them to have gotten it right, essentially. And we as citizens can't manage this risk on our own. And at the same time, the financial pressures amongst some of our participants in private rented accommodation meant that they were almost unwilling to think about the issue. And when asked to kind of vote at the end, that group in Cardiff, our group of private renters in Cardiff, pretty much refused to vote on what their preferred option was. They just weren't prepared to consider it unless they were guaranteed that it would be cheaper and that that it wouldn't impact their rents. They wouldn't be drawn on this kind of preference game. It was just a total rejection of the choices available. So by way of conclusions, I think people are by and large willing to tolerate a degree of inconvenience and disruption, but there are some red lines that tend to be shaped by kind of both their biographies and who they are and what they value in their homes, but also kind of anticipated benefits. And while environmental benefit ranked quite low when compared to cost, and people always said, yeah, we'll take the cheaper option over the environmentally friendly option. When it came to things like hydrogen, where there are questions about, well, where's the CO2 from this natural gas actually going? There did have to be some kind of environmental benefit. Some disruptions that we encountered can be anticipated due to building age or size. So avoiding period heat pumps, I think, are definitely going to be tricky in smaller terrace housing. But others are kind of biographically patterned and can't be just picked up from looking at kind of local records of house building and when houses were built. They're biographically patterned, and it's the histories of kind of do-it-yourself improvements to the house, future plans for renovation. We had several participants that had imminent plans to convert their lofts and were quite concerned about, well, I don't really want a heat pump, a hot water tank for a heat pump going up there because I already have plans for that space. And those are going to need to be navigated quite carefully, I think, and quite sensitively, particularly if we start looking at kind of gas boiler phase outs and an element of compulsion in low carbon heating uptake. As I already mentioned, there's this crisis in the UK private rental sector that made heat decarbonisation pretty much unthinkable for a fairly significant minority of our participants. And our participants had big questions about how they can be sure that they're getting the right solution. And we had all sorts of discussions about what kind of independent advice and bodies needed to be regulating this, but questions over how they would be appointed, how they would make their decisions, that I haven't quite had time to go into in terms of the analysis yet. This is still kind of ongoing work. And yeah, that's it really. Thank you for listening, and happy to take questions at the end.
Great. Thank you, Gareth.